He thought no one could reach his autistic daughter after her mom's funeral. Then a stranger folding laundry at midnight proved him wrong. Owen Reyes had exactly 40 minutes between the end of a 24-hour shift and the start of whatever his daughter needed from him next, and he'd planned to spend every one of those minutes doing laundry in peace, right up until the dryer 3 machines down let out a buzzer loud enough to split concrete, and the whole night went sideways in about 4 seconds flat. What started as one more exhausted trip to a coin-op laundromat turned into the first real conversation his daughter had about her mother in 4 straight years, and it came from a total stranger holding a bottle of detergent instead of anybody who was supposed to know how to fix it. Owen was 33, a firefighter paramedic working 24 on and 48 off out of Engine 14. The kind of schedule that sounded generous on paper and never actually felt like it once you factored in a 7-year-old who needed picking up, feeding, and settling every single day, whether he'd slept 6 hours or 0. His wife Maren had died 4 years back, a brain aneurysm that took her down in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday with no warning worth a name. And Owen had spent every day since then rebuilding a life around a kid who processed the world in a way neither of them had been fully prepared for, even before they lost her mother. Nora was 7 now, autistic, sharp as anything when she felt safe, and capable of going fully nonverbal the second a room got too loud or too bright or too unpredictable, which made grocery stores, dentist appointments, and apparently laundromats into their own separate categories of risk he had to plan around. Most nights he ran through the same mental checklist before they walked into anywhere new. Headphones charged, weighted lap pad in the bag, a visual schedule card in his back pocket, showing pictures of what was about to happen in order. Because Nora did better with almost anything if she could see it coming instead of having it sprung on her. He'd learned most of it the hard way, through a rotating cast of therapists and one particularly patient occupational therapist named Dana, who'd spent 2 years teaching him the difference between a tantrum, which had a goal behind it, and a meltdown, which didn't, and how completely different those two things needed to be handled, even though they looked almost identical to somebody watching from the outside. Tonight, the firehouse's industrial washer had thrown a bearing 2 days earlier, and the replacement part wasn't coming until Thursday, which meant Owen's entire duffel bag of turnout stain station laundry had piled up past the point he could keep ignoring it. And with his usual babysitter down with the flu, he'd loaded Nora into the truck at 11 at night and driven to the 24-hour laundromat 2 blocks from his apartment because it was that, or run out of clean socks by Friday. He'd brought her tablet, her noise-reducing headphones, and the small weighted lap pad her occupational therapist recommended. Laid out the whole routine like a checklist before they even walked in, and for the first 10 minutes it worked fine. Nora sitting cross-legged on a plastic chair with her headphones on, watching the same 3-minute cartoon clip on a loop while Owen fed quarters into the machine. The laundromat itself was the kind of place that hummed even when nothing was running. Long fluorescent tubes overhead that flickered every few seconds in a rhythm too fast to consciously notice, but plenty fast enough to wear on somebody whose brain processed light differently than most. Rows of top loaders and industrial dryers lined up under a ceiling, stained yellow from decades of dryer exhaust, and a vending machine in the corner that hummed its own separate frequency just slightly out of sync with the overhead lights. Owen had been in and out of enough of these places over the years to stop noticing any of it. But Nora noticed everything, always had, and tonight the dryer 3 machines down chose the exact wrong moment to finish its cycle and let loose a buzzer that cut through the whole building like a fire alarm going off inches from somebody's ear. Nora's hands flew to her headphones, pressing them harder against her skull like she could physically force the sound back out. And within seconds, she'd slid off the plastic chair and curled down onto the floor between 2 washing machines, rocking, her breathing coming in short, ragged pulls that Owen recognized immediately as the start of a full shutdown, rather than something he could talk his way out of. He crouched down beside her, keeping his voice low and even the way 4 years of practice had trained him to, telling her she was safe, that the loud sound was over, that he was right there, but none of it landed the way it usually did. And he watched his daughter disappear further into herself with the same helpless, practiced patience he'd used on 100 worse nights than this one. An older man folding towels near the front window glanced over with the kind of expression that wasn't unkind exactly, just uncomfortable. The look of somebody who didn't know what to do with a scene like this and was grateful it wasn't his problem to solve. Owen kept his attention on Nora, tried the counting exercise her therapist had taught them, tried offering the weighted lap pad, tried lowering his voice even further, and none of it moved the needle. And for a second he felt the particular exhaustion of a man who'd run into actual burning buildings and still felt more powerless in a laundromat at midnight than he ever did on a fireground. That was when Lena Marsh set her laundry basket down on the folding table without a word and walked over, not rushing, not announcing herself, just moving with the kind of unhurried certainty of somebody who'd been in this exact situation more times than she could count. She was 29, a paraprofessional who split her hours between 3 different elementary schools in the district supporting kids with sensory and behavioral needs. And on top of that, she picked up weekend overnight shifts at a residential respite facility because paraprofessional pay alone didn't come close to covering rent on her own, which was the actual reason she was doing laundry at midnight instead of some more reasonable hour. Between the 2 jobs, she was pulling somewhere around 50 hours most weeks, paraprofessional work during the school day, and overnight shifts at the respite facility on Fridays and Saturdays, where she helped families get a weekend break by supervising kids with high support needs in a small group home setting. And by the time Sunday night rolled around, she was usually running on fumes and doing chores like laundry at whatever odd hour her schedule actually allowed. She'd picked up the noise-canceling headphones and the extra detergent out of her own paycheck months back after realizing how often she ended up needing backup supplies in the field. Not because anybody at either job had asked her to keep a kit like that, but because showing up prepared had just become part of how she did the work. She didn't crouch down right next to Nora, kept a few feet of distance instead, and spoke first to Owen rather than the child, low enough that it wouldn't add another voice into an already overloaded room. Mind if I try something? I work with kids on the spectrum for my job. Won't touch her without her say-so. Owen looked up at her, weighing it for half a second against every instinct that told him strangers didn't fix what specialists with years of training sometimes couldn't. But something about the flat, practical way she'd said it, no pity in it, no performance, made him nod. Yeah, please. Lena lowered herself to the floor a few feet from Nora, not directly in front of her, angled slightly to the side the way she'd been trained to approach a kid in distress without crowding their field of vision. And she started counting out loud, slow, and even, 1 number per breath. I'm going to count to 5 with you, okay? You don't have to do anything. Just breathe when I breathe. 1. She paused, breathed audibly enough for Nora to hear it under the headphones. 2. Nora's rocking didn't stop, but it slowed, fractionally, the kind of change most people in the room wouldn't have caught. 3. Owen watched, not moving, not saying anything, trusting a stranger's process, purely because his own hadn't worked in almost 10 minutes straight. 4. Lena reached into the tote bag slung over her shoulder without breaking the rhythm of her voice, pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones distinct from Nora's own, industrial-grade ones she carried for exactly this reason, and set them on the floor within Nora's reach rather than handing them over. 5. There's a pair of headphones right here if you want them. No pressure. It took another full 2 minutes. Real minutes, not the kind that resolved themselves in a heartbeat, before Nora's hand finally moved, slow and uncertain, reaching for the headphones on the floor and pulling them on over her own, and her breathing began to even out by degrees, the rocking slowing until it stopped altogether, her whole body settling the way a pot stops boiling once the heat drops rather than all at once. Lena stayed where she was, patient, not pushing forward even as the worst of it passed, and it was only once Nora's shoulders had fully dropped that she reached into her laundry basket and pulled out an unopened bottle of detergent, twisting the cap and holding it a careful distance away, letting the scent drift rather than pushing it toward the child directly. This is bright meadow, free and clear kind, no dyes, no heavy perfume, just a little something. Sometimes a familiar smell helps more than anything anybody says. Nora went still in a different way this time. Not frozen, focused, and slowly lifted her head, eyes tracking to the bottle in Lena's hand with an intensity that made Owen's stomach turn over even before his daughter spoke. "That's the yellow box smell," Nora said, quiet, hoarse from the crying but clear. "Mommy's box was yellow like that." The room didn't go silent. The dryers kept running, the lights kept humming, but for Owen, the rest of it dropped away completely, because his daughter hadn't said one unprompted word about her mother in 4 years. Not since the funeral, not since every therapist and teacher and family member had gently, carefully given up trying to bring it up at all. Lena didn't react with surprise or make it bigger than it needed to be, just nodded slowly, matching Nora's tone. "Yeah, that's a nice smell to remember. I like it too." "Mommy used the yellow box," Nora said again, quieter this time, testing the words like she wasn't sure they'd hold. And then she reached out and, for the first time all night, let herself lean sideways against Owen's arm instead of curling away from everyone. Owen sat there on the laundromat floor with his daughter's weight against his side and his throat too tight to manage much more than a rough "thank you" directed at the stranger still sitting a few feet away. And Lena just shrugged like it hadn't been much of anything, capping the detergent bottle and setting it back in her basket. "She did all the work. I just held still and smelled like soap." They didn't exchange names right away, didn't trade numbers, didn't turn the moment into anything bigger than it already was. And by the time Owen had gotten Nora calm enough to finish loading the dryer, Lena had already gone back to folding her own laundry a few machines down, quiet and unbothered, like calming down another person's kid in the middle of the night was just one more ordinary task on a long list of them. It wasn't until she reached into her tote bag for dryer sheets that Owen noticed the laminated badge tangled in the strap, clearly forgotten there from an earlier shift. A district photo ID with her name printed under a school logo he vaguely recognized from Nora's own school district paperwork, and he found himself staring at it a beat longer than was probably polite, filing it away without any real plan for what he'd do with it. Just certain he wasn't ready to let this particular night end as a coincidence he'd never see again. He finished loading the last of his own laundry into a dryer, fed the coin slot, and sat back down next to Nora, who'd gone back to her tablet with her new borrowed headphones still on, occasionally glancing over at the woman folding shirts a few machines down, like she was checking that she was still there. Owen didn't say anything else to Lena before she gathered her basket and headed out into the parking lot a while later, partly because he couldn't find a version of thank you that felt big enough for what she'd actually done, and partly because some small, stubborn part of him didn't want to make more of it than it was. Not yet. Not until he'd figured out what he was even supposed to do with a name on a badge and a scent still lingering faintly in the dryer sheets he'd end up folding an hour later, long after Nora had fallen asleep in the truck on the drive home. For 6 straight days after the laundromat, Nora asked about the laundry lady at some point during almost every conversation, usually out of nowhere, usually in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone she used for anything that had lodged itself permanently in her thinking. And by the 6th day, Owen Reyes had stopped pretending he wasn't going to do something about it. What started as a name on a laminated badge turned into an actual working friendship built on car repairs and behavior charts. Right up until a hallway conversation at Nora's school turned the whole thing into something a lot more complicated than either of them expected. He hadn't wanted to come off as the kind of guy who tracked a stranger down off a photo ID, so instead of showing up somewhere uninvited, Owen had done the boring, legitimate version of figuring it out, calling Nora's school front office on his next day off, identifying himself as Nora's father, and asking whether a paraprofessional named Lena Marsh worked in the building. The office manager, once she'd verified his parent's status in the system, confirmed that Lena worked as a district behavioral paraprofessional who rotated through 3 elementary schools providing push-in sensory support, and that she happened to cover Nora's building 2 mornings a week, though she wasn't assigned specifically to Nora's classroom. That was enough for Owen to catch her in the hallway the following Tuesday during afternoon pickup, standing near the front doors in the same tired, practical way she'd carried herself at the laundromat. A canvas bag over one shoulder loaded with what looked like sensory tools, rather than personal belongings, fidget items, and a set of laminated visual cards clipped to a binder ring. He almost didn't say anything, second-guessed the whole plan standing there in a hallway that smelled like industrial floor wax and cafeteria pizza. But Nora spotted her first, tugging hard on his hand and saying her name loud enough that half the parents in the pickup line turned to look. "That's her," Nora said, no hesitation at all, pointing with the same directness she used for everything. "Laundry lady!" Lena turned, clocked the two of them, and her face did something complicated for half a second before settling into a small, genuine smile. "Hey, you two. Small world." "Not that small," Owen admitted, feeling more awkward standing in a school hallway than he ever did walking into an actual fire. "I called the office. Figured that beat stalking you through a parking lot." "Efficient," Lena said, and something about the dry, unbothered way she said it eased the tension out of his shoulders. "She been asking about me?" "Every day," Owen said. "I think you might be the first adult outside her therapy team she's brought up unprompted in a while." Lena crouched down slightly, meeting Nora at closer to her eye level without crowding her space. Same instinct she'd used at the laundromat. "That's a nice thing to hear. You doing okay today, Nora?" Nora nodded, already halfway distracted by the visual cards clipped to Lena's binder, reaching out one careful finger to touch the laminated edge of one without asking, and Lena let her, angling the binder so Nora could see it better, without either of them making a production out of the interaction. "I owe you more than a hallway, thank you," Owen said. "That night mattered more than I think you realize." "You don't owe me anything," Lena said, straightening back up. "But if you want to actually say thanks, buy me a coffee sometime. I'm not above accepting caffeine as payment for professional services rendered at midnight in a laundromat." That coffee turned into a standing, low-key arrangement over the following weeks, nothing either of them called dating out loud. Just Owen showing up with 2 coffees on the mornings he knew she'd be at Nora's school, sitting for 20 minutes on a bench near the bus loop while Nora colored nearby, and Lena walked him through actual strategies instead of vague reassurance. The kind of specific practical information he'd been hunting for since Marin died and never quite gotten from anybody with real training. She taught him how to build a visual schedule that actually worked instead of the generic ones a therapist had printed off a website years back, showed him how to read the early physical signs of an oncoming meltdown before it fully took hold. Hand flapping that changed rhythm, a particular hum Nora made under her breath. The exact 10 seconds where redirection still had a chance of working before it didn't. She also taught him things that had nothing to do with crisis management. Small daily adjustments that made ordinary hours easier instead of just damage control for the hard ones. Like switching Nora's school folder to a color-coded system so she could sort her own homework without needing to ask, or keeping a spare set of headphones in the truck so a forgotten pair at home didn't turn into its own kind of emergency. None of it was dramatic, all of it was useful. And Owen found himself filling up the back pages of a spiral notebook with her suggestions faster than he'd ever filled anything a professional had handed him in an official binder. "You're better at this than half the people we've paid actual money for," Owen told her one morning, watching her demonstrate a hand signal Nora could use instead of words when she needed a break. "I've just seen a lot of kids," Lena said, waving it off. "Doesn't make me smarter than a therapist. Just means I get more reps in a week than most people get in a year." He found his own way to pay it forward without making it into a bigger gesture than it needed to be. Her car, an aging sedan with 140,000 miles on it, had developed a high-pitched squeal every time she started the engine cold, loud enough that she'd started wincing every morning in the school parking lot. And when Owen finally asked to take a look, she waved him off twice before giving in on the third ask, more out of exhaustion than actual reluctance. He found the problem in about 90 seconds with the hood up, the serpentine belt glazed and cracking along its ribbed edge, the tensioner pulley wobbling slightly when he spun it by hand. The kind of wear that happened gradually enough that most people ignored the noise until the belt actually snapped somewhere inconvenient. "Belt's shot, and your tensioner's got play in it that's going to eat the next belt just as fast if you don't replace both together," he told her, wiping his hands on a rag from his own truck. "I can grab the parts from the auto store up the street, have it done in under an hour if you've got somewhere to be after." "You don't have to do that," Lena said. the same reflexive deflection she'd used about the coffee. "I know I don't have to," Owen said, echoing without realizing it. The same flat logic she'd used to explain the headphones and the detergent weeks earlier. "I've got the tools in my truck bed, and 40 minutes before I need to grab Nora. Might as well use both for something useful." She let him do it, standing nearby, handing him tools when he asked instead of just watching, and somewhere in the middle of threading the new belt around the crankshaft pulley, she started talking about her own life in the unguarded way people sometimes do when their hands are busy with something else. Mentioning the respite shifts, the student loans still hanging over her from a program she hadn't finished the first time around, the fact that most of her actual training had come from on-the-job certifications rather than a 4-year degree, which meant she got paid less than teachers with half her practical skill and twice her theoretical knowledge. "That's a raw deal," Owen said, tightening the last bolt and stepping back to test the tensioner by hand. "It's the deal," Lena said, shrugging in a way that looked more tired than resigned. "Kids like Nora need people who actually know what they're doing, and the system pays those people like they're barely essential. I complain about it sometimes, and then I show up the next morning anyway, because the alternative is somebody less trained doing the job instead." The engine turned over, clean and silent when she finally tested it. No squeal, no wobble, and something about the small, practical fix seemed to loosen something between them that all the coffee conversations hadn't quite managed. Both of them standing in a school parking lot at 4 in the afternoon. Grease on Owen's hands and something warmer than gratitude sitting behind Lena's eyes when she thanked him. It was a colleague of hers, a veteran paraprofessional named Renee, who'd worked the district for almost 20 years, who put a name to the thing neither Owen nor Lena had said out loud yet. Renee caught Lena in the staff lounge a few days later, having clearly noticed the pattern of morning coffees and a father who lingered a little too long at pickup and laid it out flat over a cup of break room coffee neither of them was really drinking. "You know the district handbook's got a whole section on staff relationships with families you serve, even indirect contact like yours. Somebody files a complaint. Doesn't even have to be a real problem. Just has to be a question mark next to your name during a review. And that can follow you into every job you apply for after this one." "I'm not assigned to Nora's classroom," Lena said, though even she could hear how thin the defense sounded once she said it out loud. "I rotate through the building. That's different." "Different enough to hold up if somebody complains?" Renee asked, not unkind, just direct in the way people get when they've watched enough careers get complicated by good intentions. "You've got 2 more years before you're eligible for the higher pay tier. You really want to risk that over a guy you met doing laundry?" Lena didn't have a clean answer for that, and it sat with her for the rest of the week, turning over every time Owen's truck pulled up near the bus loop with 2 coffees balanced in the cup holders, until she finally caught him on a Thursday afternoon before Nora came barreling out the front doors, her voice lower than usual, careful in a way that told him before the words did that something had shifted. "I need to slow this down," Lena said, arms crossed loosely, not defensive, just bracing. "Not because of anything you did. There's a real professional line here, and I've been walking right up against it without thinking hard enough about what happens if I cross it and it goes wrong." Owen studied her for a second, the same steady read he gave a fire scene before deciding how to move through it. "Is this about the job, or about something else you're using the job as a reason not to say?" "Maybe both," Lena admitted, quieter now. "But the job part's real, Owen. I can't lose this work over something that hasn't even had a chance to prove it's worth losing it for." He didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded once, slow, the same controlled stillness he'd have used standing outside a building, deciding whether it was safe to go back in. "Okay," he said, "then we don't rush it. But I'm not going anywhere just because you need some distance to think straight." Lena looked at him a moment longer than she probably meant to, then nodded back, and neither of them said anything else about it before Nora came sprinting out the doors with a crayon drawing clutched in one fist, oblivious to the fact that the 2 adults standing near the bus loop had just quietly agreed to step back from something that had barely even started. Both of them carrying the same unspoken question about whether stepping back now would turn out to be the smart move or just the safe one. 3 weeks into the distance Lena Marsh had asked for, A fire alarm test nobody had flagged on the school calendar turned an ordinary Tuesday morning into the kind of emergency that pulled both of them back into the same hallway faster than either one had planned on letting happen. What started as two people carefully keeping their distance turned into a partnership neither the school district's handbook nor either of their own guarded hearts had a clean rule for anymore. Owen Reyes had spent those 3 weeks doing exactly what he told Lena he would, which was nothing dramatic, just showing up the same way he always had at pickup, not pushing for more coffee, not calling more than the occasional text about Nora's progress with the new visual schedule, letting the distance be real instead of just performed. He still used every strategy Lena had taught him, still kept the color-coded folder system running, still noticed the early signs of an oncoming meltdown before they fully took hold. And some nights, folding laundry alone after Nora went to bed, he caught himself reaching for the same brand of detergent out of habit rather than any decision he remembered making. He'd run into Renee, the veteran aide who'd started the whole conversation about district policy, at a school fundraiser during that stretch, and instead of the awkward exchange he'd braced for, she'd just given him a small knowing nod and said Lena was doing the right thing, being careful, and that careful didn't always mean forever, which was about as close to an apology as the woman seemed capable of giving without actually saying sorry for anything. Nora, for her part, had asked about Lena less often as the weeks went on, not because she'd forgotten her, Owen suspected, but because 7-year-olds adjusted to new routines faster than adults ever gave them credit for, filing people into whatever category made sense until something came along to update it. The trouble started at 8:40 in the morning when the elementary school's fire alarm testing, scheduled by a maintenance contractor who hadn't properly notified the front office, went off 3 separate times within a 10-minute stretch instead of the single scheduled test everybody had been told to expect. For most of the building, it was an inconvenience, kids covering their ears and giggling their way through an unplanned drill. But for Nora, sitting in a classroom that had already thrown off her morning routine with a substitute teacher covering for her usual aide, 3 unexpected alarm blasts stacked on top of each other was enough to trigger a full shutdown severe enough that her classroom teacher followed district protocol and called the building's crisis response line. That call routed straight to Lena's cell phone since she was the on-call sensory support aide covering 2 other schools that morning, and she was in her car and pulling out of a parking lot across town within 90 seconds of getting the page, running through the mental checklist she kept for exactly this kind of call, extra headphones in the trunk, the weighted lap pad she carried for situations just like this one, and a text sent to the front office asking them to keep Nora in a low-stimulation space rather than the noisy hallway until she arrived. Owen got the call 4 minutes later, off shift that day and halfway through mowing his own backyard, and he killed the engine, dropped his work gloves on the deck, and was in his truck before the school secretary had finished the sentence, explaining what was happening, driving the 11 minutes to Nora's school faster than he'd have admitted to anybody wearing a badge. He spent the entire drive running through the same mental inventory he used pulling up to any scene. What he knew, what he didn't, what he could control in the next 5 minutes versus what he'd just have to ride out. He sat through enough calls in his career to know panic never sped anything up, only made a person sloppier right when precision mattered most, and he forced his breathing into the same even 4-count rhythm he used walking into a structure with limited visibility, because whatever was waiting for him in that school needed a steady adult, not a frightened one. He found Lena already in the small resource room near the front office when he arrived, sitting a few careful feet from Nora, who was curled into the corner between a bookshelf and the wall with her hands pressed hard against her ears, rocking in the same rhythm Owen recognized from the laundromat months back. Except this time, it had been going on for almost 20 minutes straight instead of resolving quickly, the alarm testing having done more damage to her morning than one buzzer ever had. "She's not tracking verbal cues right now," Lena said quietly when Owen crouched down beside her, filling him in without taking her eyes off Nora, professional and steady, even with 3 weeks of unresolved tension sitting between them. "I've tried the counting, tried the headphones, she's not ready for either yet. Sometimes with a bad enough or stack of triggers, you just have to let the nervous system run its course a little before anything lands." "What do you need from me?" Owen asked, matching her low, even tone instead of asking the question every instinct wanted him to ask first. "Just be here. Low and steady. She knows your voice better than anybody's." Lena glanced at him for the first time since he'd walked in. Something passing between them that had nothing to do with the crisis in front of them and everything to do with the 3 weeks they'd spent not talking about it. "We do this together, same as the belt, same as the headphones. You're not extra here. You're half the plan." They worked the next 15 minutes as a genuine team, Owen keeping his voice low and constant, the way Lena had taught him, narrating small, predictable facts. The bell wasn't going to ring again. Lunch was still on the same schedule. His truck was parked right outside whenever she was ready, while Lena tracked the physical signs, the rocking, the breathing, the exact moment Nora's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch that told her the worst of it had crested. When Nora finally reached for the headphones on her own, sliding them on without anybody handing them to her this time, both adults let out a breath at almost the same second, neither one making a bigger deal of the coordination than it needed to be. The resource room itself was small and deliberately plain, a single table, a beanbag chair in the corner, blackout curtains somebody had installed over the one window facing the parking lot. The kind of space every school Lena worked in kept tucked away for exactly this purpose, quiet enough that the overhead lights hummed at half the volume of a normal classroom. Owen noticed, not for the first time, how much thought went into rooms like this that most parents never even knew existed until their own kid needed one. And he found himself grateful in a way that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with knowing his daughter had people looking out for exactly this kind of morning, even when he wasn't the one in the building. Once Nora had settled enough to sit quietly with a fidget toy from Lena's bag, coloring in slow, careful strokes at the low table in the corner. Owen and Lena stepped just outside the resource room door, close enough to keep watching through the window, far enough to talk without Nora hearing. "I put in the paperwork 3 weeks ago," Lena said before Owen could say anything at all. "Requested a reassignment, off Nora's building entirely, off anything connected to her case. It finally cleared through district HR last Friday. Another aide takes over the push-in rotation there, starting next Monday." Owen studied her, careful not to read too much into it too fast. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," Lena said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly around the edges of the flat, practical tone she usually kept. "But sitting in that resource room a minute ago, watching us work a crisis together, like we've done it 100 times. I realized the thing I was protecting by keeping my distance wasn't actually the job. It was just fear wearing the job's clothes. So I fixed the actual problem instead. No more conflict of interest on paper. No more question mark next to my name if anybody ever asks." "That's a real fix," Owen said, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for 3 straight weeks. "Not just a feeling, an actual fix." "I've had good teachers on that front lately," Lena said, the corner of her mouth pulling up despite everything. "Somebody taught me that fixing the real problem usually beats waiting around, hoping it resolves itself." Through the resource room window, Nora looked up from her coloring, spotted both of them standing there, and held her drawing up against the glass without a word. A rough crayon sketch of 3 stick figures standing in front of what was unmistakably meant to be a washing machine. Yellow scribbles in the corner that could only be one thing. Owen studied the drawing through the glass for a long moment. 3 stick figures with careful, deliberate proportions, the kind of detail Nora only put into things that mattered enough to get right. And he thought about how far they'd come from a girl curled on a laundromat floor, unable to stand fluorescent light, to a girl calmly coloring a family portrait 20 minutes after a triple alarm test had nearly taken her whole morning apart. Progress in this house never announced itself with fireworks, just showed up quietly in a crayon, drawing held against a window, and Owen had learned by now to notice it exactly when it happened, instead of waiting for something bigger. 2 months later, on an ordinary Sunday evening, Owen stood in his own laundry room, folding a load of towels while Nora sat on the floor, nearby sorting socks into pairs with the same careful precision she brought to everything. A habit Lena had turned into a game months back that had somehow stuck around long after the novelty should have worn off. "Odds are on you for the striped ones," Nora said without looking up, holding two nearly identical gray socks up to the light like she was appraising them for flaws. You always lose the striped ones first. Lena herself was down the hall, helping Nora's homework folder get organized for the coming week, a routine the three of them had settled into, without either adult ever formally announcing what they'd become. Some things just accumulating quietly enough that naming them out loud would have been beside the point. On the shelf above Owen's own washer, next to a half-empty bottle of stain remover and a spare roll of dryer sheets, sat a bright yellow bottle of detergent, free and clear, the same brand Nora had once recognized from across a laundromat floor. No longer anything unusual in this house. Just one more ordinary item on an ordinary shelf. Lena wandered in from the hallway partway through, leaned against the doorframe with a stack of graded worksheets under one arm, and asked whether anybody planned on actually finishing the sock pile or just admiring it from a distance. And Nora answered by holding up a matched pair like a small trophy before going right back to work without further comment. Owen caught Lena's eye over the top of a folded towel, didn't say anything either, and went back to folding. The three of them settling into the same unremarkable rhythm that had somehow become the realest thing in his life. No grand declaration required. Just a bright yellow bottle on a shelf and three people who kept choosing, one ordinary Sunday at a time, to stay in the same room. Some kids need a grand gesture to feel safe again. Nora just needed somebody who noticed the small stuff and stuck around long enough to prove it wasn't a one-time thing. If that kind of quiet, steady love hit different, subscribe for more stories built the same way, and tell us in the comments the smallest detail from this one that stuck with you.